Oh, the grand finale!
Yeah.
Somebody will listen.
All right. So we've had an interesting day, and I want to congratulate the folks who participated so far. They've done a good job of kind of bringing in the people that were not on their necessarily on the panels. But now we have an explicit charge for the people on this panel. Their job is to share their thoughts and reactions and try to synthesize some of the viewpoints that were brought out today. And I think people can take away a lot of different things from today, and we're going to find out what some of the folks have to say. We're going to start off the Honorable Ron Cass.
Oh! Thank you, keep it up! Keep it up, Ron!
Thank you so much. Such a delight to be here. First of all, I have to start off by thanking all the Henrys there are in the audience. The Henrys who helped organize the conference, the Henrys who built the law school, and I also appreciated Todd's talk at lunch, which not only was a thoughtful talk, but it dealt with the topic of the conference, so none of the rest of us need to do that. Now, Peter Betke did something I was going to do, was talking about the way Nobel Prizes are described. He was talking about the way the Nobel laureates are asked to describe them. I was always more interested in the way other people did. You know, whenever an economics Nobel is awarded, they have these talking heads that tell you what it really was about. So that, for instance, for the prize that was awarded to Milton Friedman, they said, well, he showed that money actually matters. And for Jim Buchanan, they showed that people in politics actually do things in their own self-interest, which was a shock to most people. I was particularly interested, though, when I was hearing somebody try to explain to his grandfather what the Nobel Prize winner, Einstein, had done in his work. Of course, he didn't get the Nobel Prize for relativity. He got it for the photoelectric effect paper that he wrote because relativity was too controversial. But he tried explaining, this guy tries to explain to his grandfather what relativity is. And he does all the detailed explanation and nothing's computing. So finally he says to his grandfather, look, if you're spending just a minute sitting on a hot stove, it feels like forever. But if you're spending an hour looking at a pretty girl, it feels like just a minute. And the grandfather smiled and nodded and said, for this, your Mr. Einstein gets the Nobel Prize. So we're dealing with people who really did remarkable things, who made remarkable contributions, and I will try to describe it in a way that does no justice to any of them. All of these people, Armin and Jim and Bob, all made a lot of special contributions to this law school. They did both the teaching and the recommending and training of teachers here, and the inspiration of faculty scholarship, and I'm not going to talk about any of that. I am going to talk about some of the principles that tie their work together that you heard described in the earlier papers. And I have to say that the things that you look for in scholarship, you look for clarity, consistency, and insight. The authors we're talking about here all had the ability to write and speak very clearly. Consistency was something that they weren't as interested in because each of them followed his thought where it took him. Each of them was willing to follow an idea no matter where it led. I recall at one point I was talking to Armin Alchian. We did some teaching together. Henry Manny and Doug Ginsberg and Armin and I did some joint teaching in the program for judges. And I was talking to Armin one day about some ideas he had on search costs. And Armin said, you really can apply this anywhere, for instance, in marriage. And you wouldn't know from his conversation, he had a 70-plus year marriage with Pauline. He said, I thought the efficient amount of search was really not that much. You could look around and find somebody who was attractive and genial, and you were going to do a lot better if you invested a great deal more. But those sorts of comments, which will get you in trouble at home, if you follow the ideas where it leads you, can lead to some interesting things. One of the things that I think comes from conversations that we're having today, all the different papers, is that there were some real special insights that these authors had that were applicable in a whole lot of different venues, in a lot of different places. And I think there are 5 big principles that tie the work together. First is the understanding that when you deal with human institutions, they're the result of a lot of individual human actions. So unless you look at individual human actions, how they actually function, you can't understand the bigger picture of human institutions. And all 3, Armin, Jim, and Bob, all had that understanding. Secondly, the understanding that over a long enough period and a large enough sample, most human activity has a tendency toward efficiency. That was very clear in the work that Armin did in a lot of his writing, but it was also clear that this underlay a great deal of what Bob Bork had to say in the antitrust field in particular. The third big principle is the importance of institutional design. And while this was to some degree important in the work of all 3, it was particularly important for Armin and for Jim Buchanan. The fourth principle that runs through the work is the limitation on the ability of any one person, any central decision maker, any one entity to actually get things right. Anyone who has been in government has had this driven home to them. I noticed when Josh was here, he gave the disclaimer that he wasn't speaking for his colleagues on the FTC or for the institution. When I was a commissioner at the International Trade Commission, I used to have to say I wasn't speaking for the institution or my colleagues, or maybe even for myself by the time I got back, because usually what I was saying was not something that was going to be congenial to anybody at the staff there or in my own office. The fifth major principle that runs through the work of all these people is the benefits of limiting the role of any decision maker. If you don't believe that any one decision maker is going to have the information and the capacity to get things right, you want to give people limited roles. And in particular, when Bork and Buchanan talked about this, judges needed to have a very limited role. You heard about this in some of the presentations, particularly about Bork's work, but it was an important principle that ran against a great deal of academic writing and runs against a great deal of academic writing today, because law professors are all proto-judges, and they understand that each one of them is capable of reasoning through any problem and getting to an intelligent answer, no matter how much that answer might offend anyone here. They are generally proponents, and particularly in the con law area, proponents of relatively expansive powers for judges. Bob's work ran against that. If you look at some of the particular contributions here, I won't go into detail on the individual contributions because we've heard a great deal about that, but let me just say a couple words about each. First of all, for Armin, the notion that private mechanisms develop that work out solutions was a very powerful idea, and he ran that through an awful lot of different examples where he looked at how the world worked, looked at what was happening, and explained why it happened that way. There's an old story about the difference between an optimist and a pessimist, which says that the optimist thinks this is the best of all possible worlds, and the pessimist is afraid that he's right. Well, Armin was able to look at both sides of that in his work. For Jim Buchanan, he really looked at the bigger picture of constitution making, of constituting government, of looking at how government structures work. He saw the possibilities for rent seeking and saw how institutions could make those better or worse. And Bob Bork did writing, as we've heard, in areas that range from antitrust, where he actually developed the mainstream. One of the curiosities for those who lived through the fight over his nomination to the Supreme Court were the antitrust scholars who went up to Capitol Hill and testified that his work on antitrust was out of the mainstream. And it was out of the mainstream because people who wrote before him wrote about some things, and then he wrote, and then people after him wrote what he wrote. And the courts adopted his views. He created the mainstream. This was an effort to marginalize his contribution that I thought was disingenuous and unfortunate. But his writing there, which embodies these principles, really has given rise to a lot of follow-on writing by people that, and I don't know whether you want to call it the Chicago School or any other particular Vaughan economics crowd, but it has recognized the limitations on what antitrust decision-making can be and should be. It understands that antitrust law originally was criminal law. This was written, and it still is today. These were felonies. These were not open-ended precepts given to judges to criminalize anything they wanted to. They were focused on very particular sorts of behavior that were thought to be dangerous and unfortunate. And Bob gave a construct which, while not rooted in what was going on at the time the Sherman Act was written, made sense of the act. And it was very fortunate for that. It gave us, as Doug Ginsburg said, it gave us a structure that was both sensible and economizing on the resources of the judiciary and also giving a sense of predictability to the law that didn't exist before, even if it was ahistorical. His work on con law was similarly ahistorical. Bob didn't pretend to be doing legal history. He wrote a piece that is justly famous, which takes the First Amendment entirely out of context, takes the free speech clause entirely out of context, which is understandable because we know a few things about this. First of all, what's clear about the First Amendment? It says Congress shall make no law. It doesn't apply just to Congress. It doesn't apply just to making laws. It talks about the freedom of speech, which at the time that phrase was used in the Constitution had an actual meaning. That meaning was entirely subsumed within the speech or debate clause in the Constitution, which is one of the reasons why Madison had opposed originally writing this into the Bill of Rights, the way he had opposed initially the entire Bill of Rights. But he was persuaded ultimately that it was worth including this because people were worried about it. If you look at this in terms of what Bob's writing said about the Constitution as the meaning was understood, it is a profound mistake. But Bob's work had an impact, and the impact it had was twofold. First, it did emphasize the tie between the First Amendment and the structure of the Constitution which dealt with politics. Bob's work is what helps us get from the decisions that are kind of big and flabby and loose about First Amendment issues to the Citizens United decision, which, although it, in popular imagination, is a terrible decision that opens up the world to all sorts of things that it doesn't do, it is actually a decision that says we don't trust government to regulate speech about government. A fairly sensible precept, and one that would be congenial to those who wrote the First Amendment. The second thing that Bob's First Amendment scholarship does is it emphasizes again the limited role of the judge. It emphasizes that interpreting constitutions ought not to be an exercise in deciding what you think is right. It ought not to be what Ronald A described as writing a serial novel, making it the best it can be, thinking of what law would look like if you could write it in the best possible way according to your own lights. Bob's conception was that the judge had a very limited role, and that view has had a profound effect on scholarship in this area. The last thing I want to say, these are all people who not only had thoughtful ideas, powerful insights, and developed them in ways that were very accessible and very important. They also had great enthusiasm for ideas, for talking about ideas, for sharing them with you, for talking with you about them. They all were willing to engage. no matter where or when. You could be at a party, you could be talking, walking down the street, almost anywhere, anytime. These were people who loved talking about ideas. I'm reminded, as we think back to how they thought about their own place. The comment that was made, there was an interview with the person who had just become the world's oldest living person. And I think somebody pointed out this is a really cursed title because whoever gets it dies soon after. But the woman who had just become the world's oldest living person was asked by the interviewer, you know, I'm sure there are a lot of bad things that come with being 117. What's the best thing about being 117? She said, no peer pressure.
All right, next up is Terry Anderson.
Thanks, Henry. Great to be here. I'm not quite sure how I got on this panel, though I did know all three of the people we're honoring, and I'm pleased to think about their impact hear about their impact on all of you, and to talk a bit about their impact on me. Before I start, however, as I was listening to Dick Wagner talking about the wolf and the lamb question, I leaned over to Jeff, and Jeff said, how do you maximize social welfare? You do it for human beings, and I immediately knew the answer. You hang the wolf on the wall and you eat lamb chops. And for those of you who have suffered through before, no hats today. You got those from Bruce. And despite the fact Dave Haddock needs the no E-word lecture, I won't give that one either. But rather, I want to talk a little bit about what I've entitled The Influence of Alchian, Bork, and Buchanan on PERC, my home institution, or the evolution of Austrian ecology. You probably haven't heard of that yet, but I think it exemplifies the impact they've had on a great deal of the subdisciplines in economics. Coming from Montana, I couldn't help but pick up on Todd's point about it's better to look out the window than look at the blackboard. For me, I'd actually rather be outside, not just look outside. And in fact, I suspect that's partly why environmental issues are so important to me. I remember once we had a congressional staffer visiting at PERC, and she said, you really care about the environment, don't you? And I said, well, you don't live in Montana and endure winter if you don't like living here. And she said, and you think markets could help solve environmental problems? I said, yes. And she said, I guess I'm going to have to think about it. And in fact, I use that as a jumping off point because how I came to think about markets, certainly, as Todd suggested, had a lot to do with my upbringing at the University of Washington, but it had to do with meeting the three people that we've been honoring here today. And I think that the story I'm about to tell about the influence of these three people on my thinking about the environment is again, not too dissimilar from many of the sub-disciplines in economics that these have all had such an impact. When we started PERC in 1980, Buchanan and I guess to a lesser extent Bob Bork, and to be sure the entire public choice school were really a driving force in what we were thinking about. Bork had some impact on a book that P.J. Hill and I wrote entitled The Birth of the Transfer Society, a book that I wrote thanks in large part to Jim Buchanan, who got me a National Fellows Fellowship at the Hoover Institution. And as I was thinking about Jim, I remember so vividly applying for that, and I got my rejection letter after Jim had written this really glowing letter for me, and I ran into Jim at the Southern Economic Association meetings about a day after I'd gotten the letter. Jim said, well, when do you leave for Hoover? And I said, I was rejected. And he looked at me and said, you're kidding. He said, I wrote this glowing letter. No. I said, well, I have a letter saying no. So time passes. The next year I got a call from the Hoover Institution saying, reapply. And I said, look, I'm not reapplying unless you give me some indication that, that I'm really going to be accepted. Because I said I went through this once. And so I reapplied. Same thing, got my rejection letter, go to the Southern Economic Association. First person I ran into was Jim. He's smiling all over. He said, when do you leave? I said, I was rejected again. And as some of you who know Jim, he got a little red in the face. And I thought, I don't know who he's going to call, but I'm glad I'm not on the other end of the phone. And about 2 hours later, I got a phone call saying, actually, you're invited. So thanks to Jim Buchanan, I spent a year at Hoover, and PJ and I wrote The Birth of a Transfer Society, talking about the ideas that Jim wrote and Dick have also written about the notion of a productive element of government, but a redistributive element that we need to be worried about. And that really came to be part of what PERC focused on. In fact, I suppose one could say that PERC's equivalent of the calculus of consent was a book that was edited by John Bodden and Rick Stroop entitled Bureaucracy versus Environment. And so the first 10 years at PERC were spent bashing bureaucracy, asking the question, you really think that government can improve the environment? We had lots of examples of subsidizing water projects, of subsidizing insurance for people who built on the barrier islands. So that was kind of the easy part of PERC's initial years, using public choice, but using it to really help, I hope, debunk some of the myths that only government can fix the environment. But that really led us to eventually ask the question, well, okay, if you're so smart, if not bureaucracy, if not government, what then? And our answer was really, I suppose, very much the kind of thing that Armin taught us to think a lot about, namely, think about the incentives that come through markets and prices. And I was thinking about one of my favorite examples of this, because it's coming up again in the news today, and it has to do with the ban on ivory trade. And I remember vividly when my daughter was about 10 years old, she's looking through Time magazine. She was pretty geeky then, still is probably. And she's reading Time, and there's a picture of this pile of ivory being burned in Kenya, and she looks at it and she says, "That's stupid." And okay, that's so. Why do you think that's stupid? And I can remember the quote perfectly. Think about it. If you destroy all that ivory, it will drive up the price, and it will only lead to more poaching. Armin Alchian would have been proud of that. He would have thought, boy, this girl has got potential. And yet, next week, despite what most of us have learned about incentives, next week in Denver, Colorado, they're about to destroy a big stockpile of ivory to help somehow slow down poaching. It was about that same time that I met Jim Buchanan. This was before the Hoover connection. I met Jim Buchanan when he was visiting at BYU, and Jim was there, and PJ and I were invited down to present a paper that we were working on dealing with the evolution of property rights in the American West. And it was really, Jim really inspired us. I don't think ever, PJ went to the University of Chicago, so he'd been in the big leagues. I was at Washington, which was kind of a farm club. Sorry, Bruce. You know, here was Jim Buchanan listening to our paper and encouraging us to get this thing in print and thinking it was a really important piece. And it really led us to think more about how property rights were the answer to the, if not the bureaucracy, what. And it got us to eventually work more on what has come to be known as free market environmentalism. And my colleague Don Leal and I wrote a book with that title in 1991 that was really very much of the kind of ideas we've talked about today. But it was mostly a theory about how markets might work for the environment if only we had property rights. And so we went through lots of examples that Armin came and visited at PERC, Jim came and visited at PERC, and they loved these kinds of stories that we were able to tell at PERC. But early on, there weren't that many of them, and we focused much more then on just where do property rights that might help us deal with environmental issues, something that, as someone mentioned earlier, Jonathan Adler's played a big role in. Where do these property rights come from, and how, as they evolve, might they make a difference? And so fast forward We went through 1991, the first edition, which was kind of the theory. The second edition in 2001 of Free Market Environmentalism had a few examples. I remember Armin listening to Rick Stroop and John Bodden talk about the Rainy Preserve, a wildlife sanctuary that the Audubon Society owns down off the Gulf Coast, and Audubon being willing to allow drilling for oil once they found out that, yes, they could call the shots for how the drilling occurred, and yes, they would get some revenues. And we thought these were great stories of how free markets might work for the environment, all, I think, at least in part inspired by my interaction with Jim and Armin. And now, Dawn and I are about, hopefully, to publish the third version of Free Market Environmentalism, this time with a subtitle, The Next Generation. And I'll conclude by talking about what that subtitle means and how I think it relates especially to Armin's work. There's really a double entendre to this subtitle. One is that the new generation is new ideas of how markets might work, and I think Jeff's and Todd's paper that kicked this off this morning is perfect, and I'm going to go back and revise one of the chapters to make sure I give Armin the due credit for how he wrote about evolution. Because I've started rethinking how I think about the environment, especially after meeting a Dan Botkin, an ecologist, who says, the environment is not a Kodachrome moment, it's a moving picture. For all of you who are younger than Fred McChesney, Kodachrome moment referred to something called film, and so it would be what you'd get on your iPhone today. But it's not this still life, it's not this snapshot, it's this evolutionary sort of thing. And that then led me back to a point Todd made about about exchange, not maximization. It's not about equilibrium, it's about entrepreneurship. All of these are ideas that Armin and Jim especially sort of taught me to think about, and yet they have not really been incorporated into much of the work that I've done or that we've done at PERC until recently. And one of my young colleagues, Sean Regan, has dubbed the term Austrian ecology, that we need to take the ideas of Austrian economics and think about them in the context of ecology and the environment. And if you do that, you get away from the Kodachrome moment to thinking about a moving picture. And once again, I think that the initial presentation about Armin's work is how we need to really think about environmental issues and how we human beings might interface with those environmental issues. I said it's a double entendre, and I'll close by saying that the second part of the next generation is that each of the chapters in the new version of Free Market Environmentalism are co-authored with young people, which doesn't make them all that young. They're young relative to me. But people who have either are at PERC or come through PERC in our graduate fellows programs and other programs, and have co-authored chapters with Dawn and me. And I think this leaves a real lesson for the graybeards in the crowd. Those of us today talking are standing on the shoulders of giants like Jim and Armin and Bob. And I think that we all owe so much to the legacy they've given us. But I think it also points to an obligation that we have, because on our shoulders become the shoulders on which that next generation will have to stand. I think the new version of Free Market Environmentalism and the great opportunities I've had to work with young people at PERC have given me an opportunity, I hope, to help provide that platform for them. But I thought Todd's remarks at lunch were particularly appropriate for George Mason. George Mason is a place that certainly stands on the shoulders of the people that we've honored today, but it also has provided tremendous shoulders for the young people who are here as part of the Journal and part of the Federalist Society. And I think we all need to remember what we've learned from the Armins, the Jims, and the Bobs, and at the same time live up to the standard that they set. In doing so, I want to give a big thanks to people whose shoulders I still stand on, Big Henry and Little Henry, because they're the ones who really have made today possible, and I greatly appreciate that. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Barry. Next up, John Lott.
And John, by the way, has a book down here that is available to pick up in the bar.
Well, I really appreciate being invited here. This is kind of a special connection with George Mason in terms of Armin and everybody else, and that is, I probably would never become an economist if it wasn't for Henry Manning. You probably didn't know this, but I was growing up in Miami. Henry was running the law school at the time, and he had invited M. Bruce Johnson to come and teach down there or be there at the law school. And Bruce Johnson ended up being my next door neighbor in Miami. And so after my sophomore year in high school, I was sure I was going to become a historian at the time. I figured, well, I got an economist next door, economics and history probably matters, so I'll go over and ask him what I should read. And so Bruce gave me 7 econ principle textbooks. And so that summer after my sophomore year, I took them home and I read them. And one of them was by Armin Alchian, Exchange and Production, and it was such an amazing book that I couldn't believe people could get paid for thinking about those types of interesting questions. And so Henry Manning's probably responsible for me being an economist. So, and of course then it led to me being able to know people like Bob Bork and Jim Buchanan and stuff too. So I have a connection with all 3 of them there. So anyway, I wanted to say one fast thing about Todd's lunch talk, and that is, he's talking about all the stuff that George Mason's kind of gleaned from other places, but the thing is UCLA or University of Washington or University of Virginia aren't what they used to be. You have stuff here that you no longer have at other places. So what I wanted to do is just briefly talk about some of the papers that we're talking about today. And I think the most interesting paper to me was the one by Jeff Nanny and Todd. It's useful. It brought up 2 points, basically using Armin's paper to go and explain you don't need rationality, obviously, and how it corresponds to the behavioral economics, both in terms of evolution and in terms of the institutions that are there. I'm not sure it's right, though. And let me just explain why I have this. Though I do think it's a very interesting paper. And that is, start with the issue about what firms maximize. The normal presumption, the presumption in this paper is that what firms maximize are profits. I don't think that's right. I think what firms maximize is portfolio value. I'll give you a few examples. I actually have a paper with Bob Hansen from Tuck on this. And that is, when I was at Wharton, I got to meet the vice president for TIAA-CREF one time, and he was talking about Texaco and Pennzoil. They were involved in a big legal dispute at the time. TIAA-CREF owned stock in both of those companies. They were spending a huge amount of money just transferring money between those 2 companies, a lot of waste that was involved there. And I was asking him, did it bother him about the lawsuit? Did he try to talk to him? And in fact, what he did was he said TIAA-CREF and other funds went in and put pressure on Texaco and Pennzoil to go and settle their case much sooner than they would have settled it otherwise, in order to save that kind of resources being used to transfer the money back and forth. He also mentioned that they had been involved in some of the legal action between Apple and Microsoft, and because all they cared about maximizing the total, not whose pocket the money went into. But there's a range of other types of issues that you see this type of thing. T. Boone Pickens and Kyoto, one of the firms in the Toyota Keiretsu. I don't know if you remember this, but about a decade ago, there was all these complaints about T. Boone Pickens was saying this one firm, this Keiretsu, is kind of these vertically related firms, that they could make more money. Well, they make more money by charging, they made inputs that went into Toyota cars. They could charge more money by that, but it would lower the value of all the firms in the Keiretsu at the same time by them doing that. And so the other companies that owned stock in all the different companies were strongly opposed and fought T. Boone Pickens to be able to do that. But you see this in lots of things. It's not just TIAA-CREF and looking at big cases like Texaco and Pennzoil, but they can internalize lots of different types of externalities that exist. And And so there's this trade-off between thinking of them trying to maximize individual firm value or total market value. And one test that Bob and I did, we looked at when you have mergers. One of the puzzles in the merger literature is that often the value, the market value of the buying firm falls when you have a merger. The value of the acquired firm goes up, the total value rises. Well, if and it was interesting, if we looked at when you had a public company buying a private company, the value of the public company would rise in those mergers. But when you had a public company buying another public company, you'd often, on average, see it fall, but the total would rise. And it's pretty clear why you'd only, in the case where a public company is buying a private, you'd only see mergers that occur there when it would rise, because it's unlikely that some other, institutions, funds would own stock in both of those. Well, so here's the puzzle, or here's the point that's relevant for this if you buy it, because I'm not going to go through all the arguments that are there right now. And that is, there's a clear mechanism that's pretty easy to work in Armin's type of discussion when you have profit maximization. You've got a business, right? Somebody lends you money when they shouldn't, they'll go out of business. And so there's this bankruptcy constraint that's there. But when you're talking about having these funds operate in some way so that they're going to maximize the total portfolio value of the fund that's there, it's a lot more difficult to think of, random action on the part of these investors to get enough together to have that particular type of actions that would maximize the value of the portfolio. I mean, even if I go and tell you that you want to go and maximize the value of the portfolio that's there, it's not obvious to me that internalizing these externalities would be the next obvious thing that would be coming down the pipe there. And so it's kind of a higher order, lower probability type of event that would be occurring. Now, one of the things, so I like the paper overall in terms of this idea about even with irrationality, you can still get efficient results and how that deals with the behavioral economic stuff. I suppose maybe it was just a lot of personal restraint on your part, but just kind of accepting that a lot of these things were irrational behavior. I had a really hard time dealing with it. Just the first of the examples that were there, this Levin Sevenson's thing, basically these real estate agents, as they've used it in other places, like Klansmen. Here, just to give you some facts here, and I'm just going through this because it's the first one that's in the list that they have. So the realtors who are selling their own houses make an extra $6,000 to $10,000 on the sale of a $300,000 house. So that's about 2 to 3% difference. And they don't say how many years the people own the homes, but let's say they own it for 2 or 3 years. 3 years, it's another 1%. Let me put it to you this way. Let's say as lawyers, okay, do you think if you go and hire a lawyer, you're going to get better legal services representing you than if I go and do it, somebody who's not a lawyer? I would hope you would. I mean, you're better at evaluating what the lawyers are and what they know than I am. I mean, I've taught at law schools for a while, but I'm sure there's a lot of gaps in my knowledge about what the law is. Or if you take somebody else. If you're a realtor and you go and you spent a huge amount of your human capital learning about what makes houses sell or not, going around and looking for deals all the time, you'd think this is a pretty small return to all their investment in human capital that they're going to be making. I'm surprised it's not larger return for these guys and not have to get into something about them cheating or trying to engage in some type of other dishonest behavior. Now, you have a discussion in there about savings and loans and others. I'll just say, it's maximizing this stuff subject to the regulations. So when there's this discussion about over-optimism, I think of something like the savings and loan. I'm not going to go into a long discussion about this, but they were overly optimistic because of the regulations that were there, rather than going and pinning it on some type of irrationality that might exist there. And I couldn't help but just mention something about Dan Benjamin's discussion where he's talking about regulators always being inferior. I'm not sure I agree that Armin would say that. And the reason is Armin had kind of this view of the world that whatever was efficient. And, because if the costs were the benefits from changing something were greater than the costs, and people would have changed it already, or they would have figured it out. And so Armin's view of the world, he was thinking of this competition much more broadly than just firms, but basically everything that's there. And I think the way I always viewed it, kind of the UCLA approach, was there was kind of two views of the world. Most economists out there, and I think the UCLA view was the minority view, most economists out there would go and say, this is the way the world should be. You know, they look at something and say these firms are behaving inefficiently. I should have some other policy that was there. The way Armin was saying, why is it that we see this particular arrangement right now? Why is it? What are the forces that would cause you to go and adopt it? And so, I think it was Josh Wright mentioned the Freakonomics book earlier. I mean, to me, that's kind of the contrast. You read that book, and it's like all sorts of things, whether it's LoJack, insurance companies are stupid because they're not mandating this. The only way they do it is if some state insurance agency forces them to have to give a discount. My view on the world, and I would think Armin's would be, well, why aren't they doing it? Go ask them. Maybe there's something that was left out of it, rather than to assume that the other people, the economists are the smart guys, and the other guys are idiots out there, to try to figure out what's missing in the simple discussion that we have there. So,